My name is Dr. Julian Vance. I'm 46 years old, and for the last 2 decades, I've operated under a very specific, rigid set of laws. The laws of biology, chemistry, and physics. I'm a trauma surgeon based out of Seattle. In my world, life isn't a miracle. It's a series of pressurized systems, electrical impulses, and fragile plumbing. If you saw what I saw every day, the way a human life can be snuffed out by a microscopic clot or a jagged piece of metal, you'd understand why I had no room for a soul. I believe that when the brain starved of oxygen for more than 6 minutes, the lights didn't go to heaven. The hardware simply crashed. It was February 12th, 2024. The rain in Seattle was that cold, persistent needle prick variety that gets under your skin. I had just finished a double shift at Harborview. I was exhausted, the kind of bone-deep fatigue where your hands start to tremor slightly when you're not looking at them. I was in the sterile, fluorescent-lit break room, staring at a cup of burnt black coffee, thinking about my divorce papers sitting on the passenger seat of my car. My life was a series of successful surgeries and a failed marriage. I felt like a high-functioning machine that was finally running out of grease. I remember a sharp, localized pressure behind my left eye. It wasn't a headache. It felt like a structural failure. I reached for my phone to call my head nurse, Sarah, but my fingers wouldn't close. The plastic of the phone felt alien, like I was trying to touch it through a thick layer of static. Then came the smell, the metallic, ozone scent of a burning circuit board. As a doctor, I knew exactly what was happening. I was having a massive intracranial hemorrhage. I tried to stand, but my vestibular system vanished. The linoleum floor, which I had walked across 1,000 times, rushed up to meet my face. I didn't feel the impact. I only felt the sudden, terrifying silence of my own nervous system shutting down. The last thing I saw was the underside of a vending machine, dusty and neglected, and I remember thinking, so this is the end of the data. The medical reality of my death was captured in a file I would later read with my own eyes. At 7:14 p.m., a janitor found me. By 7:16 p.m., I was code blue. My colleagues, people I grabbed drinks with, were now cutting my shirt open and slamming a laryngoscope down my throat. I was the patient. My blood pressure was 60 over nothing. The CT scan would later show a 7.2 millimeter rupture in the middle cerebral artery. In the world of neurosurgery, 7.2 millimeters is a death sentence. It's an ocean of blood drowning the very centers of your brain that tell your lungs to move and your heart to beat. I watched them work. I wasn't floating on a cloud. I was standing in the corner of Trauma Room 3, right next to the discarded packaging of a chest tube kit. I felt a strange, detached clinical interest. I saw Dr. Aris, a man I'd mentored, sweating through his scrubs as he struggled to stabilize my vitals. I saw the rhythm on the monitor, a flat, unyielding green line. I was dead. I knew the physiological process. The ADP in my cells was depleting, the sodium-potassium pumps were failing, and my neurons were firing their final, desperate volleys of electricity. But I was still there. I wasn't a ghost. I was a witness. I reached out to touch the stainless steel Mayo stand, and my hand passed through it without a whisper of resistance. It was an uncomfortable, clinical realization. My consciousness existed independently of my gray matter. I looked at my own body on the table. I looked gray, waxy, and utterly empty, like a suit of clothes someone had dropped on the floor. There was no tunnel of light yet, just the frantic, rhythmic thumping of Eris performing manual compressions on my chest, the ribs cracking under his weight with a sound like dry kindling. I wanted to tell him to stop, that the 7.2 millimeters had already won, that the Julian Vance who knew how to suture a liver was gone. But then, the walls of the trauma room didn't fade. They simply stopped being the primary reality. The hospital disappeared, but it didn't feel like I had moved. It felt like the filter of the physical world had been stripped away. I found myself standing in a long, corridor-like space that felt remarkably like the hospital hallway, yet it was constructed of something denser than matter. It was quiet, a heavy, expectant silence that made the frantic noise of the ER feel like a distant radio station falling out of range. I wasn't alone. Standing about 10 feet away was a figure. I expected a being of blinding radiance or a winged entity, because that's what the culture tells us to expect. But he looked grounded. He wore a simple, dark garment that looked like it had weight and texture. He didn't glow. He radiated a sense of absolute authority that made my knees feel weak, not out of fear, but out of a sudden, crushing recognition of my own insignificance. I knew instantly who it was. My atheist mind tried to find a neurological explanation: DMT release in the pineal gland, a hallucination of the collective unconscious, but the presence was too sharp for a dream. He looked at me, and I felt like a book being read from the last page to the first. "Julian," he said. His voice wasn't a sound. It was a physical vibration in my chest. "You spent your life trying to stop the transition. You treated death like a clinical error." I couldn't speak. I felt the weight of every ego-driven decision I'd ever made. I thought about the patients I'd saved just to prove I was the best, not because I loved them. I thought about my wife, Claire, and how I'd used my career as a shield to avoid the vulnerability of a real conversation. The silence stretched, heavy and thick. He took a step toward me, and the environment shifted. We weren't in a hallway anymore. We were standing in a kitchen. A very specific, mundane kitchen with a cracked tile near the stove and a pile of unopened mail on the counter. It was my kitchen, but it felt cold. It felt like a place where a storm was about to hit. "You need to see the spring," he said, and his tone shifted from gentle to terrifyingly serious. The kitchen was mine, but the atmosphere was wrong. It was early morning. The gray, pre-dawn light of Seattle filtered through the window above the sink. I saw my wife, Claire, sitting at the small oak table. She looked exhausted, her hair pulled back in a messy knot, clutching a ceramic mug as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Beside her sat a man I didn't recognize at first, a tall, sharp-featured man in a dark suit holding a tablet. "The digital audit is complete, Claire," the man said. His voice was flat, devoid of empathy. "The freeze on the joint accounts will remain until the verification of the 2026 Social Stability Compliance is met. It's not just about Julian's estate anymore. It's about the household's tier status." I tried to reach for Claire, to tell her that I had the passwords in a ledger in my study, but my hand passed through the air like smoke. Jesus stood behind me, his presence a heavy, grounding weight. He wasn't looking at the man. He was looking at Claire's trembling hands. "This is the first event," he told me. "The season of the gate." I watched as the man on the tablet swiped through a series of red and green graphs. "As of March 2026, the man continued, the hospital's pension fund has been redirected to the National Infrastructure Recovery Act. Since Julian was a primary surgeon, his unrealized labor is being taxed against the remaining balance. You owe the state, Claire. You don't own the equity in this house anymore." I felt a surge of professional outrage. I worked 80 hours a week for that pension. I yelled, but the room didn't ripple. Claire just stared at the cracked tile by the stove, the one I'd promised to fix for 3 years and never did. The gate wasn't a physical door. It was a digital and financial enclosure. I saw a notification pop up on the man's tablet. "Access denied. Tier 4 restricted." "In the spring of 2026, Jesus said, his voice cutting through my anger, "the systems men built to provide security will become the very cages they live in. The wealth you thought was yours was always just numbers on a screen, Julian. And in one night, the screens will change their mind." The scene shifted instantly. We were back at Harborview, but it wasn't the sterile, controlled environment I knew. The hallway was crowded, not with patients, but with staff. I saw Sarah, my head nurse, standing by the nurse's station. She wasn't wearing her scrubs. She was wearing a plain gray coat, clutching a cardboard box of her personal belongings. "You can't just revoke the licenses," she was saying to a security guard who stood blocking the entrance to the ICU. "The mandate is clear, Sarah," the guard replied. He looked uncomfortable, refusing to meet her eyes. "Anyone who hasn't transitioned to the integrated health protocol by April 1st is an unverified risk. You know the drill. It's for the safety of the collective." I looked at Jesus. "What is this?" "Sarah is the best nurse in this city. This is the second event," he said. "The sifting of the service. Those who rely on their titles for identity will find themselves nameless. By the spring of 2026, the institutions you worshipped, the hospitals, the courts, the universities, will demand a confession of faith not in me, but in the system, and those who cannot give it will be cast out." I saw Sarah walk toward the sliding glass doors. As she passed the sensor, it didn't open. She had to push it manually, a heavy, grinding sound of metal on metal. Outside, the streetlights were flickering. There was a strange silence over Seattle. No sirens, no distant hum of the I-5. Just a cold, expectant hush. The fracture isn't just professional, Julian, Jesus said. He turned me around, and suddenly I was standing in my own living room again. But the furniture was gone. There were boxes everywhere. Claire was arguing with her sister, Megan. "You're going to lose everything if you don't just sign the digital waiver," Megan hissed. "It's a checkbox, Claire. Just a checkbox. Why are you being so difficult?" "Because it's not just a checkbox," Claire whispered. "It's a pledge. I won't do it." "Then I can't have you staying here," Megan said, her voice breaking. "If the audit finds out I'm harboring and unverified, they'll freeze my kids' accounts too. I'm sorry. I have to think about my family." The betrayal was surgical. It was clean, quiet, and devastating. I watched my wife, the woman I had ignored for my career, stand alone in a room full of boxes, losing her sister over a digital waiver. The environment narrowed. The hospital and the house faded into a dark, pressurized space that felt like the interior of a heart. It was just me and him. The warning was no longer about the world or the economy. It was about the man I saw reflected in his eyes. "You think you are a victim of these events, Julian," he said. "But you helped build the world that creates them." I flinched. "I saved lives. I stayed in the or until my feet bled." "You saved bodies to avoid saving your soul," he countered. The words didn't hurt. They dismantled me. "You chose the cold logic of the machine because it didn't require you to love. You preferred a world of data because data doesn't have a heartbeat. And now, the data has turned on you." He stepped closer, and I saw the third event beginning to manifest in the air between us like a gathering storm. It wasn't a visual of a city or a person. It was a feeling of a profound, irreversible switch. "In May of 2026, he said, the great exchange occurs. The world will offer a solution to the chaos of the first two events. It will offer bread for the hungry and security for the audited. But the price of the bread is the image of the Creator within you. You will be asked to trade your humanity for a functioning bank account." Suddenly, I felt a sharp, searing pain in my chest, the exact spot where Dr. Eris was still performing compressions in the physical world. The connection to my body was pulling me back like a heavy anchor. "Why are you showing me this?" I gasped. "I'm a dead atheist on a table. I have no influence." "You have a choice," he said. "The 7.2 millimeter rupture is a fact of biology. But I am the author of the biology. If you return, you will return to a world that is already ending. You will lose your status. You will lose your wealth. You will be unverified. But you will have your wife, and you will have the truth." "And if I stay?" I asked, looking at the peace radiating from him. "Then you leave her to face 2026 alone," he replied. The weight of my own selfishness hit me harder than the cardiac arrest. I looked at this switch manifesting, a world of glowing screens and cold hearts, and I knew I couldn't let Claire stand in that kitchen by herself. But as I made the choice, I saw a final image, a digital calendar on a wall. May 14th, 2026. A single word was written across the date in bold, black letters, closed. The pressure in my chest intensified, a rhythmic, violent thud that felt like a sledgehammer hitting a wet bag of sand. Back in trauma room 3, my ribs were yielding. But here, in the presence of the Christ, the physical pain was secondary to the moral weight of the decision. I looked at the image of May 14th, 2026, that black, closed stamped across the digital calendar, and I felt a cold dread that no medical textbook could describe. It wasn't just a business closing. It was the closing of a door on the human soul. "If I go back," I whispered, my voice sounding thin against the divine resonance of the space, "I go back to a world that will eventually hunt people like Claire. People who refuse the gate. People who won't sign the waiver. You go back to a world that is shaking so that the things which cannot be shaken may remain," he replied. He didn't offer me a comfortable life or a restored career. He offered me a front row seat to the collapse. I thought about my hands. I had spent my life using them to fix the temporary. I had sutured arteries that would eventually harden and fail anyway. I had patched up livers that would eventually stop processing toxins. I had been a technician of the terminal. But looking at Jesus, I realized I wanted to be a witness to the eternal, even if it cost me the very status I had spent 46 years building. I saw a flash of my office at the hospital. The framed diplomas, the surgeon of the year, plaques, the leather chair. In the light of 2026, they looked like trash. They were wood and paper and ego. "I choose her," I said. "I choose the truth." The moment the words left my consciousness, the switch he had mentioned earlier, the great exchange, flashed before me one last time. I saw a line of people in a sterile, white corridor, similar to my hospital but devoid of any warmth. They were holding their wrists out to a scanner, and as each one passed, a green light chirped. They looked fed. They looked secure. But their eyes were flat, like the eyes of the patients I had seen in end-stage dementia, present, but the person was gone. I understood then. The bread they were receiving wasn't just food. It was a buyout of their conscience. I felt a sudden, violent jerk, as if a hook had been set in my sternum. The kitchen, the hallway, and the figure began to blur into a single, blinding point of light. The transition was not a peaceful drifting back into sleep. It was a car crash. It was the sensation of being shoved back into a suit of armor that was 3 sizes too small and currently on fire. My first sensation was the crunch of my own chest. The pain was absolute, a white-hot agony that forced my eyes open against the glare of the surgical lights. Rhythm. We have a rhythm. Someone was screaming. It was Sarah. She was leaning over me, her face masked and shielded, but I could see the tears pooling in the bottom of her goggles. Pulse is 110. BP is 90/50. He's back. My God, Julian, stay with us. I tried to speak, but the endotracheal tube was a cold, plastic snake in my throat. I gagged, my body instinctively fighting the intrusion. My brain felt like it was being compressed in a vice. The 7.2 mm leak was still there, a physical reality that the divine encounter hadn't simply erased. I was a doctor again, and I was performing a self-diagnosis in real time. I had right-sided hemiparesis. I couldn't feel my right arm. My vision was tunneled. Dr. Aris stepped into my line of sight. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the 20 minutes I was down. He was holding a syringe, his hands shaking. We're prepping for an emergency craniotomy, Julian. We're going to get the pressure off. Just hang on. I wanted to tell him it didn't matter. I wanted to tell him about the gate and the sifting and the switch. I wanted to tell him that the hospital we were standing in would be a cage by the time the cherry blossoms bloomed in 2026. But all I could do was stare at the ceiling. I saw the shadow of the surgical lamp, and for a split second, it morphed into the shape of that digital calendar. I realized with a jolt of terror that I wasn't just back to live, I was back to warn. But who would listen to a neurosurgeon with a broken brain? As they wheeled me toward the OR, the sliding doors hissed open. The same doors I had seen Sarah push manually in the vision. The sound was a chilling echo of the future. Recovery was a slow, agonizing crawl through the wreckage of my former life. The surgery was successful in the sense that I lived, but the Dr. Julian Vance, who could perform a 10-hour microdissection, was dead. My right hand remained clumsy, the fine motor skills gone. I was forced into a medical retirement at 46. The surgeon of the year was now a disabled claimant. It was now late 2025. The world felt like it was holding its breath. The news was a constant stream of economic reorganization and digital integrity initiatives. Most people ignored the jargon, but I heard the echoes of the gate. I sat in our living room, the one I'd seen empty and filled with boxes in my vision, and watched Claire. She was different now. After my death, I had told her everything. Not the light and love version of an NDE, but the cold, hard warning of 2026. We were sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in November. I was struggling to use a fork with my left hand when Claire's phone chirped. It was a sharp, dissonant sound I hadn't heard before. She picked it up, her face turning the color of ash. "Julian," she whispered. "It's from the bank and the insurance company. It's a joint notification." I took the phone with my good hand. The message was displayed in a clean, minimalist font. "Urgent. Your account status has been flagged as pending verification. To maintain access to liquidity and healthcare coverage for the 2026 fiscal year, please complete the Social Stability Attestation by December 31st. "It's starting," I said. My voice was raspy, a permanent gift from the intubation. "What happens if we don't click it?" Claire asked. "The gate closes," I replied. I looked at the cracked tile by the stove. I had finally fixed it 3 months ago, but now it didn't matter. The physical house was stable, but the foundation of our life was being pulled out from under us. I saw the fear in her eyes, the same fear I'd seen in the vision, but there was something else there, too. A spark of the unshakable thing Jesus had mentioned. Then came the second blow. A text from Megan, Claire's sister. It was a screenshot of her own verified status, highlighted in a bright, cheerful green. I just did mine. It took 2 minutes. Don't be stubborn, Claire. The kids need their college funds, SEC. Yerd. Just sign it. The personal fracture I had seen in the hospital hallway was no longer a vision. It was a blue bubble on a screen, vibrating on our kitchen table. February 2026 arrived with a cold, sterile precision that felt like an antiseptic wipe across the soul of the city. I was no longer Dr. Vance. I was case file hashtag 8829JV. My right hand was a dead weight, a constant physical reminder of the boundary I'd crossed. The hospital, the place where I'd spent more hours than in my own bed, had become a fortress of the new protocol. I had been summoned there, not as a surgeon, but for a final professional alignment review. They wanted my signature on the integrated health protocol, the very mandate I'd seen Sarah fighting against in my vision. I sat in the mahogany row office of the chief of medicine, Dr. Sterling. He was a man who used to ask my advice on complex vascular repairs. Now, he wouldn't even look me in the eye. He kept staring at a sleek, translucent tablet on his desk. The room smelled of expensive floor wax and fear. Julian, Sterling said, his voice modulated into a practiced, corporate empathy. The board is concerned. You've bypassed the digital attestation 3 times now. We want to keep your emeritus status and your pension intact, but the new 2026 compliance standards for social stability are non-negotiable for all medical affiliates. It's a simple biometric pledge. It ensures we're all on the same page regarding public health priorities. It's a confession of faith, Arthur, I said, my raspy voice cutting through his jargon. You're asking me to pledge my clinical judgment to an algorithm that values utility over life. I saw this. I saw what happens when the service is sifted. Sterling finally looked up. His eyes were tired, shadowed by the same flat, gray hue I'd seen in the people at the Great Exchange. This isn't a philosophy seminar. If you don't sync your credentials by April 1st, your medical license isn't just suspended, it's erased from the National Registry. Your accounts will be Tier 4 restricted for noncompliance. You won't be able to pay for Claire's prescriptions, let alone your own physical therapy. I stood up, my left leg dragging slightly. The sifting was here. I saw Sarah through the glass partition of the administrative wing. She was carrying a cardboard box, her shoulders slumped in that exact, heartbreaking silhouette from my NDE. She didn't see me. She was just another unverified risk, being escorted out by a silent security guard. I turned back to Sterling. Keep the pension, Arthur. I've already seen where that money goes. The atmosphere in Seattle by May 2026 was heavy, like the air before a massive electrical storm. The gate had closed for the unaligned. Grocery stores had green lane scanners for the verified. The rest of us stood in lines that stretched around corners, waiting for basic rations that were often out of stock for our tier. But the real confrontation happened in our living room on the evening of May 13th. The door didn't burst open. There were no sirens. It was just a knock, firm, rhythmic, and official. 2 men in charcoal suits stood on our porch, accompanied by a social worker I recognized from the hospital. They weren't there to arrest us. They were there to offer a transition. Mrs. Vance, the social worker said, looking at Claire with a pity that felt like an insult. Your sister, Megan, has filed a concern for stability report. She's worried about your access to resources. We have the May 14th exchange authorization here. If you both sign tonight, the restrictions on your housing equity will be lifted by tomorrow morning. You'll be verified before the Great Exchange window closes at midnight. I walked to the door, feeling the presence of the figure from the hallway standing right behind me. I couldn't see him, but I could feel the weight of his gaze on my back. This was the switch. The Great Exchange. What determines the outcome? I asked, repeating the question I'd asked in the NDE. The taller man in the suit stepped forward. Participation, Dr. Vance. The outcome is determined by your willingness to integrate. Those who choose the collective security of the exchange will thrive. Those who don't, well, the system can't support those who won't support the system. It's a closed loop starting tomorrow, May 14th. Once it's closed, there's no re-entry. I looked at Claire. She was holding a small wooden cross, not a piece of jewelry, but a rough thing I'd carved for her during my recovery. She looked at the men, then at me. We know why the title of this year is what it is, she said softly. It's not about the money. It's about who owns the image on our souls. The men didn't argue. They didn't get angry. They simply marked something on their tablets and walked away. As they reached the sidewalk, the streetlights flickered and died. A deep, unnatural darkness swallowed the neighborhood. May 14th, 2026. The morning arrived with a silence so profound it felt physical. I woke up and reached for my phone, but the screen remained black, not out of a dead battery, but because the network no longer recognized my existence. I walked into the kitchen. Claire was standing by the window, watching a fleet of white transport vans moving slowly down the street, stopping only at the houses with green lights glowing on their smart meters. "Julian," she said, her voice steady but thin. "Look at the garden." I looked out. The cherry blossoms, which usually lingered through May, had all fallen overnight. They lay on the ground like a shroud of bruised white silk. But that wasn't the proof. I went to the front door and looked at the digital keypad. It was dead. I had to use the manual override key, a piece of brass I hadn't used in years. When I stepped onto the porch, I saw it. It was subtle, but for a doctor, it was undeniable. My neighbor, Mr. Henderson, was standing in his driveway. He had always been a nervous, talkative man. He saw me and raised his hand. On his wrist was a small, glowing subcutaneous mark, a faint amber light beneath the skin where he'd checked into the exchange. He looked at me, but there was no recognition. No neighborly, "Good morning, Julian." His eyes were clear, bright, and utterly vacant. It was the switch. The person I had known for 10 years was gone, replaced by a functioning, serene biological unit that was now a part of the closed system. I looked down at my own shaking, scarred right hand. It was clumsy. It was weak. It was unverified. But as I gripped the porch railing, I felt a warmth spread through my palm. The same vibration I'd felt in my chest when he spoke to me in the hallway. I looked back into the house at Claire. She was lighting a single beeswax candle on the kitchen table. The power grid stayed down for our block. The silence of the city grew heavier, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic hum of the transport vans. I sat down on the porch step and watched a single cherry blossom petal drift onto my knee. I am a doctor who died and came back to a world that is no longer mine. I pulled my old manual watch from my pocket. The second hand was still ticking, a small, stubborn heartbeat in the dark.